She looked at the hands that had saved her life, and she told me they would ruin her wedding photographs. Let that sink into your chest for a second, because I sat with that sentence in the quiet dark of my own bedroom for much longer than a second, and the jagged edges of it still haven't smoothed out. My name is Caleb Vance. I am 53 years old, and I have lived in the salt-washed, granite-carved town of Gloucester, Massachusetts, my entire life. Up until about 6 months ago, if you had asked me over a pint of dark ale down at the Harbor Tavern, I would have told you that the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to a man was already behind me, buried in the damp soil of our local cemetery and the rusted metal of the shipyards. I would have been wrong, because physical pain is a simple, honest thing. It has a beginning, a peak, and a long, dull road toward healing. But the pain that comes from the person you would have died for, the person you did, in fact, burn yourself to pieces to protect, is a completely different kind of beast. It doesn't heal. It just waits for the weather to turn cold, and then it aches in places you didn't even know you had. Welcome to Dad's Hidden Revenge. Get comfortable, because this story is going to take you somewhere. Hit that like button and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Let me set the table for you first, and I mean that quite literally, because that is where this entire illusion of a family blew apart in my face. The private dining room at the yacht club out in Marblehead smelled of expensive rosemary, white wine, and the kind of deep, generational wealth that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. It was the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, but the staff had already lit dozens of small, flickering votive candles on the tables, draping them in thick, heavy white linen that was so perfectly pressed it looked like carved marble. Apparently, when you are spending someone else's hard-earned money on a rehearsal dinner, ambiance doesn't care what time of day it is. I sat at the far end of the long table, placed deliberately across from my daughter Iris and her fiancé's family, the Cabots. The Cabots are old Boston money, the kind of family that has held the same sailing slips and country club memberships since the days when clipper ships still sailed out of Salem Harbor. My ex-wife, Clara, sat 2 seats down from me, her laugh sounding a little too sharp, a little too loud, as she nodded eagerly at everything Mrs. Cabot said about the imported orchids versus the local hydrangeas. Sitting next to Clara was her husband, Sterling Montgomery. Sterling was Iris's stepfather, a smooth-talking wealth advisor who wore his pastel cashmere sweaters draped over his shoulders like a cape and spoke about offshore portfolio diversification, as if he had ever owned a single asset that wasn't leased, borrowed, or bought with someone else's credit. He sat there with his arm draped casually over the back of Clara's chair, looking for all the world like the patriarch of the family, the successful man who belonged in a room like this, while I was relegated to the end of the table like an awkward piece of old furniture that they hadn't quite figured out how to hide from the guests. For 25 years, I had raised that girl. For 25 years, I was the one who paid for the braces, the private school tuitions we could barely afford, and the countless riding lessons she insisted she needed. And now I was the guy sitting at the end of the table, treated like an afterthought by the very people who were drinking champagne on my silent, invisible labor. The server set down these beautiful little ramekins of braised short ribs, and as the rich scent of red wine reduction filled the air, I reached across the white linen for my water glass. It was a simple, automatic movement, the kind of gesture you make 1,000 times a day without thinking. But as my sleeve pulled back slightly, I saw Iris's eyes drop to my left hand. I know what she saw. Everyone sees it eventually, no matter how much I try to keep it tucked in my pocket or covered by a leather work glove. The skin on the back of my left hand and running up my wrist doesn't look like skin anymore. It is tight, shiny, and pulled into deep, irregular ridges of scar tissue that look like white wax that had melted in a fire and hardened wrong. My ring finger and pinky don't bend the way fingers are supposed to bend. They are permanently curved inward, a frozen claw of pink, twisted flesh. I have had 20 years to get used to people staring at it, but the truth is, you never really do. You just learn to live with the quiet flinch that people try to hide when they first shake your hand. But this time, the flinch didn't come from a stranger. It came from my own daughter. Iris's face did this tiny, sharp thing, a little twitch of disgust, like she had just bitten into something sour. She leaned across the table, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the lull in the conversation. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a hushed, urgent tone that she had clearly been practicing. "I love you, I really do, but look at your hands. They're so rough, they're scarred. The photographer told us that the close-ups of you holding my hand when we walk down the aisle are going to look absolutely terrible in the album. It's going to ruin the aesthetic of the whole ceremony." The table went completely, suffocatingly quiet. Mrs. Cabot suddenly found her wine glass very interesting, rotating the stem slowly between her manicured fingers. Julian's father cleared his throat and looked out the window toward the harbor. Iris didn't stop. She looked over at Sterling Montgomery, who was sitting there wearing a smug, sympathetic smile, and she gestured toward him with her hand. "Sterling just looks more the part, Dad," she went on, her voice rising slightly as she gained confidence. "He's got nice hands. He wears a tailored suit so well, and Julian's family is very high society. I just don't want things to be awkward or for people to be asking questions about what happened to you during the ceremony." She paused, and then she delivered the blow, twisting the knife with a gentle, smiling cruelty that only a child can manage. "So we decided that Sterling is going to walk me down the aisle instead. You can sit in the back row." Nobody said anything. Sterling had the decency to at least look uncomfortable, staring down at his short rib as if he hadn't been the one who suggested the idea in the first place. Clara didn't even look at me. She looked almost relieved, as if a great, embarrassing weight had been lifted off her shoulders. I looked down at my scarred, twisted hand, still wrapped around the water glass. "I want to tell you that I said something. I want to tell you that I stood up and delivered some perfect, devastating line that put them all in their place and made them realize the absolute monstrousness of what they had just said. I want to tell you I was a hero, but I didn't say a word." I have replayed that moment in my mind probably 4,000 times since that afternoon, and every single time I do the exact same thing I did that day. I nodded slowly. I stood up, took my linen napkin off my lap, folded it once neatly, the way my mother had taught me when I was a boy in Gloucester, and I walked out of that dining room without saying a single word to any of them. You built her an entire life with those hands, and she just told a room full of wealthy strangers that they were an embarrassment. The dry docks of Gloucester were not a place for the faint of heart. The air was permanently thick with the sharp, acidic tang of acetylene gas, the heavy scent of heated iron, and the salty, freezing mist that blew off the Atlantic. Every day the massive steel hulls of commercial fishing trawlers sat propped up on colossal wooden blocks, looking like beached leviathans waiting to be carved open. I spent my days inside those hulls, squeezing my body into tight, dark steel compartments that felt like metal coffins, welding the seams of high-pressure pipes that carried superheated water and hydraulic fluid. It was a trade where a single pocket of trapped air or a hairline crack in a seam could lead to catastrophic failure. You had to respect the metal. You had to understand how it expanded under heat and contracted in the freezing winter cold. I took pride in that. I took pride in knowing that the welds I laid kept those boats afloat when they were tossing in 50-foot swells out on Georges Bank. I believed that honest, quiet labor was the highest form of self-respect. Welcome to Dad's Hidden Revenge. Get comfortable. This story is going to take you somewhere. Hit that like button and drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to love it here. The Cabots of Boston were the kind of family who had managed to turn their historical ancestry into a shield against the modern world. They didn't speak of money, they spoke of heritage. They didn't show off their wealth, they displayed their preservation of it. Their estate in Marblehead sit perched on a rocky cliff overlooking the cold Atlantic, surrounded by towering stone walls and manicured gardens that looked like they had been designed by an English lord in the 19th century. Every piece of furniture in their drawing room had a pedigree. Every painting on the wall had a signature that was registered in a museum catalog. When they looked at me, they didn't see a father who had raised the girl their son was marrying. They saw an awkward, silent intruder from the working docks of Gloucester, A man whose presence in their elegant, pristine world was an unfortunate biological necessity that had to be managed with the utmost discretion. They wanted the girl. They wanted the clean, academic version of her story. But they absolutely did not want the man who had laid the foundation for it with his sweat and blood. The coastal traffic on Route 128 North doesn't care that your heart has just been carved out of your chest with a blunt butter knife. I sat in my old beat-up Chevy truck for 45 minutes, the radio turned completely off, listening to nothing but the sound of the tires humming against the asphalt and the heavy, ragged sound of my own breathing. I kept looking at my left hand on the steering wheel, really looking at it, the way you look at a mirror after someone has told you there is something hideous on your face. You look at it hoping that maybe this time you'll see what they see. You look at it trying to find the ugliness that makes people turn away. But all I saw was the truth. I didn't cry. I want that on the record right now. Caleb Vance does not cry in traffic on Route 128. But there was a physical weight sitting in the middle of my chest, heavy and cold as a block of granite, all the way back to my modest one-bedroom apartment off East Main Street in Gloucester. It's a quiet place, exposed brick walls, overlooking the commercial fishing docks where the draggers come in at dawn. It's the kind of apartment a man rents when he has a decent amount of money, but refuses to spend a single cent of it on himself. I let myself in, dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, and stood in the middle of my small kitchen, suddenly not knowing what to do with my hands. Given the conversation I had just walked out of, it felt like a sick, twisted joke. I ended up in the small spare room that I use as an office. It's not much of an office, just a sturdy wooden table I built myself, a metal filing cabinet, and an old battered shoebox that I've kept for 20 years. I sat down on the hardwood floor, leaned my back against the wall, and pulled that shoebox into my lap. The first photograph on top was from 15 years ago. Iris was maybe 9 years old, standing outside of Captain Dust's ice cream parlor down on the harbor. She had vanilla ice cream dripping down her fist, her face covered in sticky white smudges, and her right hand was wrapped tightly around my scarred left thumb, both of us grinning at the camera like we had just won the lottery. There she was. There was my little girl. And as I stared at that faded Kodak print, the memories didn't come back slow. They hit me all at once, like a wave crashing over the breakwater in a winter nor'easter. You want to know who I was before all this? I'll tell you. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, I picked Iris up from Clara's house the second my shift ended at the shipyard. I worked as a master welder and pipe fitter at the local dry docks, doing heavy industrial maintenance on commercial fishing vessels and tankers. It was hard, honest, union work. I came home every day with calloused hands, smelling of iron filings, ozone, and grease. My work boots were always caked with Red Harbor mud, and my safety glasses were pushed up onto my forehead. But the moment I pulled into that driveway, Iris would come tearing across the yard, screaming, "Daddy!" as if I had been gone for 10 years instead of 10 hours. We had a routine, she and I. We would walk down to the harbor for ice cream. She always got vanilla, always. No matter how many times I told her they had 40 other flavors on the board, she'd look up at me with those big, serious eyes and say, "Vanilla is our flavor, Dad." And she would hold my left hand the entire walk there, swinging our arms back and forth, making me feel like the strongest, richest man in the state of Massachusetts. And when we got close to the shipyard gates, I would hoist her up onto my shoulders so she could wave at the guys working on the dry docks. "There's my hero," she would shout down at the top of my head, her ice cream dripping onto my collar, while the men on the loading dock laughed and yelled back, "You got a good one there, Caleb." My buddy Harrison, who worked the welding lines with me for 12 years, used to lean over his torch and say, "Caleb, that girl is going to run this town someday. You watch." I believed him. I truly, deeply believed every word of it. Those Saturdays were the only hours of the week that mattered to me. They were better than payday. They were better than the Patriots winning the Super Bowl. I had no idea that one of those Saturdays was going to be the last normal day of my life. It was mid-October, and the wind was coming off the Atlantic sharp and cold. I had to swing by the dry docks to pick up my physical paycheck because payroll had messed up the direct deposit that week. I brought Iris inside the main office with me. She had been in that building 100 times. Everyone knew her, and the receptionist always kept a jar of red licorice under the desk just for her. She was sitting at the break room table, drawing a picture of a sailboat on a paper napkin. While I walked down the corridor to grab my envelope, I heard it before I understood what it was. It was a deep, low metal groan that vibrated through the concrete floorboards and settled in my teeth. Then came a bang so loud it felt like a physical blow to the back of my head. One of the main steam lines running from the high-pressure boiler system had ruptured. Pressurized, superheated chemical steam, the kind that can melt flesh right off the bone in a fraction of a second, blew out of that pipe like a fire hose of pure acid. I didn't think. There was no processing, no calculation, no logical weighing of the risks. My body simply moved before my brain could even formulate a single word. I reached that break room door in 2 seconds flat, threw myself over Iris's small body at the table, and wrapped my arms and my back around her, making myself as big as I possibly could to shield her from the blast. The steam hit me across my left shoulder, my neck, and my hands. Mostly my left hand, because that was the hand I had wrapped around the back of her head, cradling her skull to keep the chemical vapor from reaching her face. I don't remember the pain of the initial burn, not really. Your body does this merciful thing where it just shuts down the signals when they get too loud. But I remember the smell. It smelled like burnt hair, sulfur, and something chemical that didn't belong in a room with a child. And I remember my buddy Harrison's voice screaming my name from somewhere very far away, his boots echoing on the concrete as he ran toward the steam valve. But most of all, I remember Iris underneath me. She was screaming, completely terrified, but she was dry. Not one single drop of that superheated steam touched her. She walked out of that shipyard without a single mark on her body. I, on the other hand, spent 3 months in the burn unit at Massachusetts General, my hands wrapped in heavy compression bandages, learning how to hold a fork again, learning how to breathe through the tight, scarred tissue on my neck. And do you want to know what my sacrifice bought me? Clara filed for divorce 4 months later. I remember sitting across from her in a cold, sterile lawyer's office downtown, my hands still wrapped in white gauze, unable to even sign the papers without the attorney helping me hold the pen. "You brought her to that shipyard, Caleb," she said, her voice flat, cold, and rehearsed. "You're reckless. I can't trust you not to put our daughter in danger again." Reckless? I nearly laughed, but the movement pulled at the tight scars on my neck and made me wince. "Clara," I threw myself in front of a steam blast to keep her alive. "I know what you did," she cut me off, her eyes vacant of any warmth. "But you're the one who put her in that room in the first place. She got full custody. I got every other weekend, then every other holiday, and then, slowly, the way ice melts so gradually you don't even notice the puddle until your boots are wet, I got less than that." Clara had 15 years to whisper in that girl's ear, rewriting the story of how her father got hurt. By the time Iris was 13, she wasn't asking me how my hands felt anymore. She was asking me why I had been so careless at the shipyard. She had been taught that her father's scars weren't the proof of how much he loved her, but rather the evidence of his own failure. And I sat there and let her believe it, because I loved her too much to wage a war that would have torn her world apart. My attorney, David Finch, was one of the few men in Boston who didn't look at my work boots with condescension. He had been my father's lawyer, a man who believed in the old-school principles of contract law and fiduciary duty. When I walked into his office 3 days after the dry dock accident, my hands still bound in sterile white sheets, he stood up from his leather chair and shook my elbow, refusing to let me feel like an invalid. We sat together for 4 hours, going over the safety records of the manufacturing company that had supplied the faulty steam valves. David was meticulous. He dug through decades of correspondence, finding that the executives had known about the metallurgical flaws in the brass fittings, but had chosen to skip the expensive testing protocols to meet their quarterly profit targets. He looked at me across the desk, his face grim, and told me we were going to make them pay for every square inch of melted skin on my body. And we did. But as the numbers began to pile up on the legal pad, I realized that the wealth wouldn't buy back the smooth skin of my hand, nor would it buy back the respect of a wife who had already decided that my sacrifice was nothing more than a reckless mistake. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. Sterling Montgomery's office in downtown Boston was a masterpiece of financial theater. It was a space designed to project a sense of absolute security and immense wealth, even though the foundations of his business were built on shifting sand. The walls were covered in deep, dark mahogany paneling, the floors draped in Persian rugs that were soft as velvet, and the shelves lined with leather-bound volumes of tax codes that had never been opened. He sat behind a massive glass desk, wearing his pristine, tailored suits and gold watches, speaking to his clients in a low, confidential hum that made them feel like they were part of an exclusive club. He talked about offshore tax optimization and private equity structures with the easy confidence of a man who had actually managed a successful fund, but in reality, he was nothing more than a high-end middleman, taking commissions from one client to pay off the debts of another. He had looked at Iris's future trust distribution as his personal gold mine, a $6 million pot of liquid gold that he could use to quiet the bank compliance officers, who were beginning to ask hard questions about his New Hampshire developments. He had convinced himself that he could forge my signature on the guarantee forms, clear the bridge loan, and replace the funds before I ever realized what had happened. He thought I was just an uneducated shipyard welder who didn't understand the complex mechanics of corporate finance. He thought my silence was stupidity. The federal marshal who oversaw the bank fraud investigation was a tall, quiet man named Special Agent Vance, no relation to me, though we shared the same rugged New England jawline. He came to my shop in Blue Ash on Wednesday afternoon, carrying a blue folder containing the digital audit trails and the forged loan documents. We sat in my small office, smelling the oil and iron from the shop floor, as he laid the pages out side by side on my desk. He pointed to the digital signature certificate, showing that the document had been authorized on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:14 p.m. The exact hour I was lying under general anesthesia in the operating room at Mass General, having a skin graft harvested from my thigh to repair the deep burns on my shoulder. Agent Vance looked at me, his eyes grave, and told me that the forgery wasn't just a civil dispute. It was a federal Class 3 felony, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. He asked me directly if I wanted to authorize the filing of the formal criminal complaint. I looked at the forged signature on the line, a clumsy, desperate imitation of my name, written by a man who had never held a welding torch in his life, and I told him that I wanted the truth to be filed. The lawsuit against the manufacturing company that had supplied the faulty high-pressure steam valves took nearly 3 years to resolve. It was a landmark case of corporate negligence and falsified safety records. In the end, we won. We won big. It was the kind of massive multi-million-dollar settlement that changes a family's entire financial trajectory for generations. But I never touched a single dime of it for myself. I remember the day the checks cleared. My attorney, David Finch, sat me down in his plush office overlooking Boston Harbor. He was looking at me like I was a lunatic. "Caleb, you could buy a house on the water in Marblehead tomorrow," he said, tapping his gold pen against the folder. "You could retire. You never have to weld another pipe in your life." I sat there in my worn work boots and my faded flannel shirt, looking at my scarred hands, and I said, "No, put it in a trust," because somewhere in the back of my mind, Clara's voice was still echoing, reckless, failure. If I spent that money on myself, wasn't that proof that she was right? Wasn't that proof that I had valued my own comfort over my daughter's future? So I set up an irrevocable, discretionary spendthrift trust. Every single dollar of that multi-million-dollar settlement was locked away, protected, and managed by me as the sole trustee, designed to release specific payouts only at Iris' major life milestones. Her 25th birthday, her wedding, and the purchase of her first home, I went back to work. I took a quieter, less dangerous trade, doing precision machine work and custom metal fabrication in a small shop out in Blue Ash. I kept my modest one-bedroom apartment. I drove a used Chevy truck with 140,000 miles on the odometer that I maintained myself, because I refused to pay a mechanic for work I could still do with my own two hands. People in town probably thought I was just cheap. They saw me walking down to the docks in the winter cold, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, and they figured I was just an old miser hoarding his pennies. Let them think that. The truth was, I was guarding a vault for a girl who, by the time she turned 20, could barely stand to look at the man who had built it for her. Clara remarried when Iris was 17. Enter Sterling Montgomery. Sterling was a smooth-talking, slick-haired wealth advisor who always wore a blazer even on a Sunday morning. He drove a leased luxury sedan that he swapped out every 2 years like clockwork, and he spoke in this low, confidential whisper that made you feel like he was letting you in on a secret, even when he was just telling you the weather. He was the kind of man who had never had 2 nickels of his own money to rub together, but he knew exactly how to make other people feel insecure about theirs. I didn't think much of him at first. I figured he was harmless, just another empty suit trying to play the part of a big fish in a small harbor. But I was wrong about him too. Somewhere around Iris's early 20s, Sterling started taking a very keen interest in her financial future. He knew about the existence of the trust, though he didn't know the exact figure, and he knew that I kept the key locked up tight. He started talking to Iris about protecting her legacy and smart financial positioning before the wedding payout hit. I didn't know it at the time, but Sterling had been drowning in his own bad investments. His luxury wealth management firm was nothing more than a beautiful, expensive front for a series of failed commercial real estate ventures out in New Hampshire. He was desperate for liquidity, and he saw my daughter's future trust distribution as his personal lifeline. He sat Iris down one night in their rented colonial house, using that same smooth Cadillac salesman voice of his, and had her sign a stack of legal documents. He told her it was standard estate planning. He told her it was a routine guarantee to secure a bridge loan for his new coastal development group that would benefit the entire family. But here is the thing about a discretionary spendthrift trust. It is a legal fortress. It runs entirely through the trustee. A bank will not accept a future trust distribution as collateral on a commercial loan unless the trustee signs off on the guarantee. Sterling knew I would say no. He knew I would look at his balance sheets and see the massive, gaping holes in his business. So he did what desperate con men always do. He forged my signature on the guarantee paperwork. He thought he would use the upcoming wedding payout to clear the debt before anyone noticed the discrepancy. He thought he was being so brilliant, so clean, so predictable. He miscalculated. My phone rang at 9:14 p.m. on the night of the rehearsal tasting. I was sitting on my office floor, the photo of Iris and the ice cream still in my hand. I picked up. It was a number I didn't recognize, a Boston area code. "Mr. Vance?" a woman's voice said, sounding rushed and highly stressed. "Hi, this is Rebecca. I am the events director at the Marblehead Yacht Club. I am so sorry to bother you so late, but we are having a major issue with the final payment for your daughter's wedding." I sat up straight, my hand tightening around the phone. "What kind of issue?" "The automated wire transfer from your attorney's office failed to clear this afternoon," she explained, her voice dropping into a nervous whisper. "The bank notified us that the funding source has been completely blocked. The bride's mother, Clara, told us to call you directly and that you would handle it immediately. Is everything all right?" I sat there on that office floor, that old photo of Iris still in my other hand, the vanilla ice cream dripping down her 9-year-old fist, frozen forever in a Kodak moment. I looked at my scarred knuckles wrapped around the phone. "Is everything all right?" I almost laughed. It came out of my throat as a low, dry sound that didn't sound like a human laugh at all. "No," I said, my voice steadier than it had ever been. "Everything is not all right. Cancel the booking." There was a sharp, sudden gasp on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. Did you say cancel?" "Cancel it," I said, my words falling like heavy iron weights. "All of it. The dining room, the catering, the harbor terrace. Cancel the entire contract." "But sir," she stammered, her voice rising in panic. "The contract is in your name. If we cancel now, the deposit is completely forfeited. That is over $40,000. "I know," I said, "and it's completely non-refundable. Once we process this cancellation, there is no going back. The date will be released immediately. I know, I said again, calmer this time, almost gentle. Cancel it anyway. And I hung up the phone. I didn't call Iris. I didn't call Clara. I sat there in the quiet dark of my Gloucester apartment with a 20-year-old photograph in my scarred hand, and I let the silence do the talking for me. For the first time in 15 years, I felt like I was actually in control of my own life. It wasn't about rage. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. Those words are too small, too loud, and they get thrown around too easily by people who have never had to bleed in silence. This was about a man finally putting his foot down and saying, "No more." I slept fine that night. What kept me awake wasn't regret. It was the waiting. I knew the storm was coming, and I knew exactly what kind of wreckage it was going to leave in its wake. The phone didn't ring that night. It rang the next morning at precisely 7:14 a.m., while I was standing at my kitchen counter, drinking black coffee and watching the gray fog lift off the harbor. Iris's name lit up the screen. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, just to see if my scarred hand would shake. It didn't, Dad, her voice came through the line, tight, high-pitched, and frantic. What did you do? The venue just called Mom. They said the booking is canceled. They said the date has been released. Is that true? Did you actually cancel my wedding? It's true, I said. Why would you do that? She screamed, her voice cracking, and for a fraction of a second the old fatherly instinct. The one that had run my entire life, the instinct to apologize, to fix it, to make her smile again even when she was the one who had hurt me, pull at my chest, but I didn't let it take hold. You told me to sit in the back row, Iris, I said, my voice cool and even. I'm just giving you a little more room back there. She went completely quiet. I could hear her breathing, sharp and shallow, and in the background I could hear Clara's voice shouting, "Is that him? Give me the phone." "You're being cruel," Iris whispered. "No, sweetheart," I said, and I want you to remember this sentence, because it was the truest thing I had ever said to her. "I'm being finished," and I hung up the phone. Now, here is the part you need to understand about the legal mechanics of this. On Monday morning, I met with my attorney, David Finch, at his office in Boston. I told him to freeze all wedding distributions from the trust immediately, citing a potential fraud concern regarding the collateral agreements. By Wednesday afternoon, the dominoes began to fall. The florist, the catering company, and the high-end band they had hired from New York all hit a brick wall. Their invoices came back marked insufficient funds. But Clara and Iris didn't call me to ask what was wrong. They went public. Clara went full Bellevue housewife on social media. She recorded a video sitting on her expensive sofa, tears practically on cue, tagging local community groups and the Cabot family's charitable foundations. My daughter's biological father is holding her wedding hostage out of pure jealousy because another man is walking her down the aisle. She sobbed into the camera. He is bitter, controlling, and vindictive. She even pinned a comment at the top. The Cabots are old money, and they have lawyers everywhere. We will see this man in court. The internet did what the internet always does. Within 12 hours, I had hundreds of messages from complete strangers calling me a monster, a deadbeat, and a disgrace to the uniform of a father. But Clara made a fatal mistake. By tagging the Cabot family's public business profiles, she brought a messy, low-class public brawl right to the doorstep of a family that valued their privacy above almost everything else. Old Boston money doesn't survive by rolling around in the mud on Facebook. They survive by getting as far away from the noise as possible. And then, the trap snapped shut. When the automated payment for the yacht club canceled, it triggered a routine compliance flag at the bank that had issued the bridge loan to Sterling Montgomery. A human auditor actually pulled the physical file to see why a multi-million-dollar trust was suddenly refusing to clear the collateral. They looked at the signature on the personal guarantee. They looked at the digital certificate IP addresses, and then they called my attorney, David Finch, to verify the document. David took one look at the forged signature and told them the cold, hard truth. Caleb Vance never signed this document. By Thursday afternoon, it wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a federal bank fraud investigation. The bank froze all of Sterling's commercial accounts and called the entire $900,000 loan due immediately. At the exact same time, David enforced the strict penalty clauses on their colonial house lease, which had been backed by the trust as a courtesy. Their monthly payments tripled overnight, giving them exactly 30 days to clear out before the locks were changed. Sterling Montgomery, smooth-talking commercial wealth advisor, was staring down a federal indictment and eviction inside a house he couldn't afford, sitting next to a wife who had just destroyed her former husband's reputation on the internet for a wedding that no longer had a venue or a groom. I won't lie to you. There was a small, quiet part of me, a very human part, that felt a sense of clean, hard satisfaction sitting in my quiet apartment that week. But mostly I just felt tired. It's funny how wood always remembers every storm it weathered, while some people forget that the seeds they plant eventually grow. If Caleb's journey left a mark on you today, do me a solid. Tap that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments below where in the world you're listening to this from. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story. The federal investigators didn't waste any time. When a bank realizes that a $6 million collateral agreement is backed by a forged signature, they don't send polite letters. They move with a quiet, devastating speed. I went to work every day that week, just like I had for 30 years. I clocked in at the fabrication shop in Blue Ash at 7 in the morning, put on my welding helmet, and let the white-hot spark of the torch drown out the rest of the world. There is a beautiful, uncomplicated honesty to metal. If you treat it right, if you prepare the joints and apply the heat with a steady hand, the weld holds. It doesn't lie to you. It doesn't tell you it loves you, and then call you an embarrassment behind your back. My buddy Harrison, who still worked the dry docks but came by my shop occasionally to grab a coffee, stood by my workbench on Friday afternoon. He was holding his phone, looking at me with a mixture of concern and anger. "Caleb, you see what they're saying about you on the community pages?" he asked, his voice rough. "Clara's got half the town thinking you're some kind of bitter lunatic who wants to ruin his own kid's life." "Let them think it, Harrison," I said, not looking up from the steel plate I was grinding. "The truth doesn't need a public relations firm to survive. It just needs time." "But Iris—" Harrison hesitated, looking down at his boots. "She knows what you did, right? She knows how you got those scars on your neck?" "She knows," I said. "She just doesn't want to remember." And that was the truest thing about the whole mess. Iris had spent 15 years living in a house where her father's sacrifice was treated as a shameful accident, a reckless mistake that had ruined her mother's credit and forced them to live in a modest house instead of a mansion. She had been taught to look at my scarred hand and see a failure, rather than the shield that had kept her own skin whole. But while she was busy posting pictures of her custom silk bridesmaid dresses and her platinum rings on Instagram, the ground beneath her feet was already dissolving. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 3 weeks after the tasting dinner at Marblehead, when the knock came on my door. It wasn't the aggressive, confident pounding of a wealthy person demanding answers. It was a soft, tentative, trembling sound, as if the person on the other side of the oak door was terrified of what they would find when it opened. I stood up from my kitchen table, walked over, and pulled the door back. There they were. Clara and Iris were standing in the dim, salt-smelling hallway of my Gloucester apartment building. They looked about as far from the elegant, polished women in that Marblehead dining room as two people could possibly get. Clara's expensive blonde hair was pulled back in a messy, greasy knot, her designer mascara smudged in dark, ugly rings around her eyes. Iris looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She was wearing an oversized college sweatshirt, her face pale, hollow, and her hands were shaking so violently she had to shove them deep into her pockets. The hands that had been too beautiful to hold mine down the aisle were now the ones trembling in a drafty hallway. "Caleb," Clara's voice cracked, sounding thin and dry as paper. Can we come in?" A month ago, she had called me a vindictive monster in front of 40,000 people on the internet. Now she was standing on my welcome mat, begging for permission to cross the threshold. I stepped back and let them in. I didn't say a word. I walked back to my wooden kitchen table, sat down in the sturdiest chair and waited. They sat on my second-hand sofa, their posture small, huddled together as if they were trying to shield themselves from a freezing wind. Iris broke first. She slid off the sofa, dropped to her knees on my worn hardwood floor, and looked up at me with those big tear-filled eyes that used to look at me from my shoulders at the shipyard. "Dad, please," she sobbed, her voice raw and cracked down the middle. "I know you're angry. I know I hurt you. I know what I said at the yacht club it was horrible. I was just so stressed, and Julian's family was putting so much pressure on us to look perfect, and I didn't think." "You didn't think," I repeated slowly. "The feds came to the house, Caleb," Clara whispered, her voice shaking as she stared at the kitchen table. "They have a warrant for Sterling. They said he forged your name on a commercial loan guarantee. They said he used Iris's future trust distribution as collateral for a $900,000 bridge loan, and the bank has frozen all our accounts. We can't even pay the rent on the house. They're going to evict us by the end of the month." "Sterling's gone, Dad," Iris cried, her hands pressing against her face. "He packed a suitcase in the middle of the night and left. He didn't even say goodbye to Mom. He just left us with the feds and the debt, and the bank says we're legally responsible because we signed the partnership papers." The Cabots, Julian's family, they found out about the fraud investigation on Wednesday. Julian called me and said his father insisted the risk to their family name was too great. "The wedding is off, Dad. The engagement. Julian, everything is gone." She leaned her forehead against my knee, her shoulders shaking with the kind of deep, ragged sobs that only come when a person's entire world has collapsed into ash around them. "Please, Dad," she whispered, "just sign the release. If you release the trust money, we can pay off the bank, we can save the house, we can start over. Please, you're the only one who can save us." I sat there in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the small refrigerator, the only sound in the room. And I looked down at my daughter's head resting against my knee. I had waited 15 years for this conversation. I had spent 15 years wondering if she would ever look at me and see her father, instead of the embarrassment Claire had painted me to be. And for one fleeting, stupid second, the old fatherly instinct was there. The instinct to reach down, lift her up, brush the tears from her face, and tell her that her daddy was here, that her daddy would fix it, that her daddy would pay the debt and keep her safe just like he had at the dry docks. But then I looked at her mouth. I looked at the hands she had shoved into her pockets, and I realized something. Even now, on her knees in my kitchen, she hadn't said it. She had talked about the venue, the house, the feds, the Cabots, and the shame of Sterling Montgomery's betrayal. But she hadn't said thank you. She hadn't said, "I remember what you did for me at the shipyard." She hadn't said, "I'm sorry I treated the hands that caught the fire for me like they were ugly." She didn't want her father. She wanted the vault. I stood up. I did it slow, unhurried, careful of the old scars on my neck that still pulled when I moved too fast. I walked over to the wooden kitchen table, sat down across from them, and I placed both of my hands flat on the clean pine surface, my right hand, whole, calloused, and honest, my left hand, scarred, twisted, pink, and claw-like, the skin pulled tight over the knuckles that had shielded her head from a chemical fire 20 years ago. "You said my hands were too ugly for your wedding photos, Iris," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through her crying like a razor blade. She froze, her tear-streaked face lifting slowly to look at the table. "But these hands," I went on, my voice steady as granite, "are the only reason you still have a face to cry with right now." Clara let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Iris stared at my scarred knuckles, her eyes wide, realizing in real time the absolute, unappealable finality of the moment. "I caught the fire for you once, sweetheart," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "I won't do it again. Get out of my home." They left in a silence I had never heard from either of them in my entire life. No screams, no slamming doors, no parting insults. Just the quiet, heavy sound of two greedy people walking down a concrete stairwell, realizing that the very cleverness they had used to abandon their father was the exact lock that had shut them out of a $6 million fortune. I didn't watch them walk down East Main Street. I stood at my window, watching the harbor lights flicker on in the gathering Atlantic fog, and I let my apartment go silent around me. Last I heard, Sterling Montgomery was arrested at a low-rent motel in Florida, waiting on a federal court date he won't be able to smooth talk his way out of. Clara and Iris were evicted from the Marblehead estate and had to move into a tiny two-bedroom rental in Norwood. Unremarkable, modest, the kind of place they had spent 15 years looking down on me for living in. As for the trust, I never released a single dollar of it to clear their debts. My attorney, David Finch, restructured the terms, locking it down even tighter than before, ensuring that not a single cent can ever be touched by Julian Montgomery, Clara, or anyone else, unless Iris herself learns the value of an honest dollar and earns her way back to deserving it. Maybe someday she will. That's not up to me anymore. That's up to her. As for me, I still live in that same one-bedroom off East Main Street. I still drive my old Chevy truck. I still work the same quiet machine shop in Blue Ash. Some Saturdays, when the weather is right and the wind is coming off the harbor smelling of salt and clean pine, I walk down to Captain Dust's. I still order vanilla, even though I've never really liked vanilla. I just liked watching her eat it. I sit on the wooden bench alone, my hands resting on my knees in the afternoon sun. These scarred, twisted, ugly, beautiful hands, and I think about a 9-year-old girl on my shoulders screaming, "There's my hero." To a harbor full of men who believed her, I'd still do it again. 1,000,000 times over, I'd still catch that fire for her. That was never the question. The question was whether she'd ever be brave enough to say thank you. She wasn't. Not yet, anyway. But these hands, they're not waiting around for it anymore. The scars we carry are often the proof of how much we were willing to lose to protect the ones we loved. If Caleb's and Iris's story touched your heart today, go ahead and hit that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and drop a comment below letting me know what city or country you're listening from. Keep your fires burning, and I'll see you on the next one.